Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next Zeitgeist video. As you can see, we're going to be talking maybe this way. I don't know. I'm not sure which way I am on the screen. We're going to be talking about Elizabethan England. Now, it's a little controversial to me that I've decided to call this Elizabethan England because the time period we're going to be talking about extends beyond the reign of Queen Elizabeth I and actually into the reign of King James I. I would like to call this early modern England, ideally, but the figure of Elizabeth looms so large over the time period and in our imaginations as we think about this time in history that it just seems like the right thing to do. When you think about Shakespeare, as many of us are, is one of the reasons that I'm making this video, many of the plays that you think about were actually even written after Elizabeth was on the throne. So plays like The Tempest, Macbeth, Othello, some of these plays were written during the reign of James and not during the reign of Elizabeth. But as I said, I think there's an expectation here. So let's get right to it and I'll stop giving disclaimers. Okay, so our expectations about this time period. Many of us have been taught that Elizabeth I's reign was this like amazing golden age for England. It was this time of exploration, of cultural rebirth, and also a time of religious tolerance after the reign of her sister, Mary, often known as Bloody Mary. But in truth, of course, it's not as simple as that, and it's not as clear-cut as that. This is a version of history, right, that wants to transform England's past into this narrative of progress. And we've already talked about this, right, that it's this idea that we want to promote specific values, where Elizabeth is this figure who moved England out of this ignorant, brutish, lazy Catholic past and into this educated, refined, hardworking Protestant future, right? So what really happened? Well, let's start by talking a little bit about the actual timeline of Reformation, going back from Henry VIII, which we already talked about in our previous video, through Elizabeth I. I'm going to do a lot of dates and a lot of information fairly quickly. You don't have to remember all of this, but it's just to give you this like scope of change. Okay, 1529, Henry VIII declares himself head of the English Church. Worship doesn't change. Nothing really changes other than the fact that the Pope is no longer the head of the church in England. 5 years later, 1534, Henry VIII requires oaths affirming his authority over the church. 2 years after that, in 1536, Henry VIII dissolves monasteries. He abolishes lots of feast days and holidays and religious traditions that were celebrated in the Catholic Church. And as a result, there's a huge uprising in the north of England. But it sticks, right? 1547, 11 years after that, Henry VIII dies. His son, Edward VI, takes the throne. Edward is all of 10 years old. We know how that goes, right? When you have a kid on the throne, never a good thing. People who are not Edward are responsible for all these decisions because, as I said, he's 10. So people are taking the opportunity to make some big changes and convince him that this is the right thing to do. A year after Edward takes the throne, images are banned from churches, vestments, the robes that priests wear are banned, holy water is banned, can't use any of this in a church. 1549, worship is officially switched from Latin to English, and the first book of Common Prayer, which is all of the prayers and religious texts of the church, is released. That's 1549. In 1552, the church is becoming, by that point, the church is becoming increasingly more Calvinist. Calvinism is like Presbyterianism today. So we're moving further and further away from the Catholic Church and into a more reformed type of worship. In 1553, Edward VI dies. His sister Mary succeeds to the throne. There is an attempt at this point to put a young Protestant woman, Jane Grey, on the throne. And Mary is initially really popular. A lot of people really wanted to return to Catholicism. There's a lot about what you're familiar with, what you're comfortable with, and the way that the world works. Like as I said, there were a lot of feast days, a lot of holidays that people used to have that were religious celebrations that they don't have anymore at this point. Mary is initially very popular. Unfortunately, she gets married to King Philip of Spain, and that causes unhappiness. The English were just deeply distrustful of Spain for various reasons that we're not going to get into right now. Mary's only Mary is queen for 5 years. Elizabeth succeeds to the throne at this point. So in 1558, when Elizabeth comes to the throne, we have what's referred to as the Elizabethan settlement. Elizabeth reclaims the authority over the English church, just as her father had done. The English population is required by law to attend Anglican worship every Sunday, by law. Some elements of the traditional Catholic religion are restored. We get some of our saints' days back. Some of those other things are restored. Elizabeth is theoretically compromising, but I'm not sure how much of a compromise it actually is. And there is once again a rising in the north of England in 1569, where there's an attempt to depose and assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots, who is a Catholic. Throughout the 1560s and 70s, the Puritans, who are Calvinists, are gaining strength throughout England. They're calling for increasing reforms in the church. There's a real tension between like the Catholic extreme on one end and the Puritan extreme on the other. But there's also this, as a result, this sort of growing number of moderates who are just like, I just want to get on with my life. Can y'all just like settle in and be okay with whatever, wherever we are. In 1570s, throughout the 1570s, there are visitations of churches by government officials to make sure that they are complying with the rules that Elizabeth has set out. There is a homily against disobedience that is preached once a month from every pulpit in England. It is a fascinating read, but we don't have time to talk about that right now. And then things just kind of settle in. 1603, after being on the throne for 45 years, Elizabeth dies. And we know at this point from the long range of history that the switch to Protestantism in England was absolutely certain it was done. But Elizabeth's subjects didn't know, right? Elizabeth died without a certain heir. There's a lot of trickiness in the succession, and the fact that James took over and what his allegiances were in terms of religion and politics and all that are kind of a mystery. And again, we don't have time to get into that. But it's important to remember that in all of this, it isn't just about religion, Religion is very important. But it's not just about what kind of worship service you attend. It's about how many days off you get. So like how much vacation time do you get in a year? It's about what you have to do in order to feel assured that you're not going to go to hell and that you get to go to heaven. It's about the traditions that you grew up with. It's about the government of your country telling you things that you can and can't do in terms of what you believe, and enforcing things that, you know, today we're all pretty much certain should be left up to our conscience, right? So there's a lot going on here, and it isn't like just about what church service you go to, right? So let's talk a little bit about Queen Mary before we talk about Elizabeth. I'm going to look at this lovely image here of Thomas Cranmer being burned alive. Was Mary really as bloody as we've been told? Let's talk about how many people were executed for purely religious reasons. These are approximate numbers. So Henry VIII executed about 60 people for religious reasons. His daughter Mary executed about 270, and Elizabeth executed about 200. These numbers are a little tricky because with Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, some of the executions that were for religious reasons were said that they were for treason. Those overlapped a lot, and Mary was a lot more explicit. She's like, nope, this is for religion. You are a heretic, you're being burnt. But all of these numbers, right, are incredibly small. That sounds like a terrible thing to say when you're talking about people being executed for their faith. I don't mean to diminish that. But when you think about in France in 1572, the St. Bartholomew massacre killed between 10 and 15,000 Protestants. Some of these numbers are really not as bad as maybe we've been taught that they were. So let's think about Elizabeth and whether or not this actually is a golden age now that we've gotten all that Reformation stuff out of the way, or at least we understand it a little bit. Was this really a golden age? You know, a lot of people are skeptical about that. I have, as is often the case, historian Kenneth Morgan has a surly and pessimistic quote for every occasion about Elizabeth. He says, her own propaganda, the cult of Gloriana, that's what she was called, was Gloriana, her sheer longevity, the coincidence of the Shakespearean moment, and the lucky defeat of the Armada have beguiled us into joining a crescendo of adulation that ignores the simple fact that she quietly allowed England to become ungovernable. My goodness, not a very great epitaph. But again, he doesn't really have much good to say about any moment in history. Here's the defeat of the Armada up here in the corner. So what about Elizabeth herself? She's a study in contradictions as a human being. Let's go ahead and look at her there. It's one of my favorite portraits of her. She really did want to be a strong monarch. She didn't think of herself as a queen. She didn't style herself as a queen, as Mary had done, but she thinks about herself as following in her father's authoritarian footsteps. She consistently, on the same end of things, presented herself as very feminine. She loved clothes, she loved jewelry, she loved flirting, she loved dancing. And she walked this line like really effectively in a way that served her well in her politics. She refused to marry because it would, on the one hand, subvert her authority as the ruler of England, but she would often consider these suitors when it was politically expedient for her to do so. Like, for example, she had this like long running sort of flirtation with the Crown Prince of France, the Dauphin, when she needed an ally against Spain. And so she did that. And then eventually she was like, oh, ha, 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 no, we can't actually do that once she didn't need the ally anymore. So it's a tricky time because there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of economic strife. There's wars going on with Spain, with Ireland. There's a lot of poor harvests. And so as a result, there's some famine, but it isn't all a myth, right? We don't have this idea of the golden age. It doesn't come from nowhere, right? So we do have this idea of improving prosperity. We're going to take a look at this lovely Tudor house in the middle of the screen here. We're getting improvements in living conditions. People are having larger homes, they're having more privacy, and there is more work to be done. The Protestant work ethic, if you've heard of that, is a real thing. These feast day holidays were all but eliminated, so people who worked did so more often and for longer periods of time. So if you ever wonder like why we have such long work days and why we struggle in this country sometimes to take vacations, we can go back to this moment in time because our Puritan forebears who came over to America were steeped in this kind of idea of this Protestant work ethic. It doesn't mean that individuals are universally more prosperous. You can still work really hard and starve because of a bad farming season or something like that. But it is like leading to things like greater social mobility. We have greater freedom for laborers to move around and seek out better working conditions and get a new trade. Merchants could be like elevated to the gentility because of their wealth, but this was still controversial, right? Like the government really wants to like keep everybody in their place, and so there's a lot of traditions that people want to preserve, and so we get this tension that's going on, right? There's also, we have at this point increasing literacy. Protestants are very keen to, as we say, that we want the weakest woman to be able to read the gospel. So there is this push for increasing literacy throughout the country. And as a result, there's also a flourishing of art and music, as you can see with this lovely lady here playing the lute. We also have, of course, like the rise of the theater, the rise of poetry. So here's the Swan Theater. And of course, we all know who this dude is right here up in the corner here. We also have at this moment, like a time that is for a lot of countries in Europe, a time of exploration, of colonization, of these kinds of things. And this isn't exactly where England is really like pushing itself in the golden age. It's much more interested in this idea of literacy and poetry and drama and like bringing England to the forefront of the world stage, because of those kinds of achievements. But we do have the beginning of colonization here. So here, as you might have heard of the lost colony of Roanoke. England was not as aggressive about that exploration as like Spain and Portugal, as I already said. We had instead people like Francis Drake and sailors like him who were like, well, they can go and do all that work and then we'll just plunder their ships. So the English were kind of known as pirates as opposed to explorers at this time period. But we do have the first English colony in North America in the 1580s. Here it is, Roanoke Island. It's a great mystery. It's short-lived. It pretty much disappears by 1590. And the real push for colonization in America happens starting in 1606, which is also the year that Macbeth is first performed during the reign of James I. And the other main thing that happens at this point is the very beginning of England's empire in South Asia. So this hasn't happened yet. It's still in the future, but Elizabeth is the first founding of the East India Company in 1600. This is the beginning of trade in South Asia and establishing that foundation for what is eventually going to be, in the much later centuries, that moment when we can say the sun never sets on the British Empire. So all of that has its roots in this time period. So that's why Elizabethan England has taken on such a mythos and has become this thing that we all have somehow like heard about and know about. I'll be curious to hear more about what y'all think about that as we think and talk about some of that literature. So thanks so much and see y'all in class. Bye.